interest in public space is kind of embedded or founded on the notion of democracy. Because for us, the public spaces of our cities, the streets, the squares, the parks, the waterfronts, the plazas, they're all things that make up democratic space. So they're places that should be places where you can move, you can be safe, and you can enjoy a city without any kind of intimidation. And I think the greatest cities that can demonstrate that and that people can enjoy those spaces are the greatest cities to occupy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of cities and public space from a sort of a historic point of view. I'll go through a little bit of a walking tour globally around some of my favourite places that I visited in various cities in sort of northern and eastern Europe, and then talk through a few of our projects and just finish up perhaps on a couple of ideas for Hobart. So, stepping back in time, sort of pre-4000 BC, the human race were effectively hunters and gatherers. So we nomadically roamed the earth. And then around 4000 BC, in the Neolithic Revolution, along came the plough. Now the plough was a crucial invention because it allowed the advent of agriculture and it allowed us to till the soil. So with that came the ability for human beings for the first time to actually become sedentary. So we were able to stop in a single place and develop our own crops and animal husbandry. And as part of that, we sowed the first seeds for trade and for local economies. So on those walking trails, at those nodes and connections in those places where we were able to stay, we developed methods of trading goods. Now, those very, very simple principles founded the first cities. And sort of looking back 6,000 years ago, 6,000 BC, this is a beautiful image of Arbel, the citadel in the city of Arbel. And it shows the kind of the patterns and the typologies that emerge from the way human beings interacted with those walking trails. So what we had was the idea, or we now are looking at in terms of city typologies, which is spaces that have actually emerged. So they weren't planned, they didn't have any of these overlays of urban design or planning, they just simply emerged. And the scale and space and the vibrancy of those spaces was absolutely incredible. Wonderful, wonderful places. So the next city I'm going to talk about is Timbuktu. So it's a fascinating example from a typology point of view. On the sort of left-hand side there, we see that emergent form where those streets, squares and places have emerged effectively. And then on the right, the planned city. So this is our more recent attempts post the motor vehicle to create a new notion of a city. So here's a sort of a schizophrenic juxtaposition of what had emerged out of these original notions of the city, and then what we began to overlay, and the spatial changes that occurred, and the sort of monotonous space that emerged as a result of the motor vehicle. And of course, the sorts of city forms that emerged with the Garden City movement, with Ebenezer Howe, the Redbird schemes, all of these ideas of planning, a sort of heroic gesture of how to make a modern city began to be overlaid, and of course resulting in these incredible failed places of great urban sprawl. So the motor vehicle city has had a huge impact, and the thing that's been happening together with that in parallel is urbanisation, and urbanisation has been running at an incredible pace. in the last 150 years. It was about 1850 that we first commercially discovered, or first commercially processed oil. And cheap oil has allowed our cities to absolutely skyrocket in the last 150 years. And now that we've now reached peak oil and we're starting to run out of that, the demand is growing. So, along with that, if we look at the growth of cities, around 1800 we had only about 3% of our population in cities. And now we know that that's around 50%. So the move from agriculture into cities has been absolutely phenomenal. And the UN Habitat predicts that by 2050 we'll have around 70% of the human race actually living inside cities. So this has been a rapid and radical change which has affected all of us, because effectively cities have become our major home in the human race. So this is the primary places that we occupy. Interestingly enough, our population is growing rapidly also. By 2050 we're anticipated to approach around 9 billion people. And the thing the statistic I find interesting is that we've now got somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 cities, above 150,000 people globally. So that's an enormous amount of cities, and an enormous amount of work for us as landscape architects and urban designers to get involved in. But I think that over that time our cities have changed radically, and what I find when I travel and look at various places and try to compare the work that we're doing in a contemporary sense, always contrasted against sort of walking through the old districts of the ancient cities or even the Renaissance cities. And I always find that the older parts of those cities are far more vibrant and they have so much more grain and life, and they're the places that I like to visit, compared to the newer interventions which somehow seem to have failed in many ways. However, there are, of course, spaces that have succeeded. So just kind of taking a little bit of a journey through some cities, and actually something that Mary mentioned, this idea that the land that we have in our cities to be able to impact with our design work is probably around 40%. So this is typically about 30% of the city is owned or under the jurisdiction of the local government, about 10% state government, and 60% in the private sector. So this 40% of the city is a wonderful place. It's effectively our fabric for being able to make interventions in terms of retrofitting our cities. So it's a very important space. So that is the 40% of the democratic side of our city. So just kind of walking through Eastern and Northern Europe, I like to kind of absorb the atmosphere and the feeling, and kind of ask the questions, why are these places so successful? What makes them so good compared to some of our Australian cities? Places like Budapest, Krakow, which is a very, very simple and actually a very large plaza. It's enormous. And it's effectively activated around its edges, but it's a wonderful place. It's a university town, and it just absolutely comes to life. And there are no cars in the main square in Budapest. In Oslo, they've done incredible work with their waterfronts recently. Really beautiful, simple interventions, very timeless and well considered. Of course, Copenhagen with its wonderful bicycle streets, where most people are taking their journeys to and from work in the city by bicycle. And to other spaces, some of the pedestrian streets in Krakow, where cars are eliminated, but incredible density and diversity and compression on these streets. Very, very active. Horses and bikes and all sorts of modes of transport. In Oslo, the main street from the station heading down into the town. In Oslo again, no cars. So it's kind of, we asked the question, why are these streets in Europe so successful without the vehicles, and how can we learn from these streets? We are in Australia now reaching a point where our pedestrian malls are actually, there's a tendency to actually fall back from them and remove them because they've been somewhat unsuccessful. And we've been working on some projects like that, and Mary just spoke about some also. So you wonder why these streets have been very successful. I think it's something to do with density, and also the fact that we have a lot of residential living inside these cities. So people actually occupy them. They're not zoned. They didn't go through that process that Australian cities have been, where we had kind of mono-zoning and we have these places of emptiness in our cities. Granada, I guess many of you will have seen Alhambra, but wandering through these streets is just absolutely amazing. It's beautiful. Krakow again. And then all the things that occupy these streets. So in the summertime, people come out and they sit on the street. You get the little bicycle tours that come out, and the plug-ins come up. The streets change all the time. They bring the umbrellas out. And I love in Stockholm just kind of finding these back lanes where you've got these kind of 600-800 mil wide spaces, and the street's sloping, but they just kind of jump in there and sit. And then even in Shanghai, sort of going completely different place, but the wonderful lanes and the work they've been doing recently in some of their cultural precincts, and then even squeezing down tighter and tighter to very, very micro spaces, which are just absolutely tremendous. And the idea of art that pops up, and the way these things transform, they treat their streets as part of their, there's a great deal of love that they have as part of their city, and they program them. In Sydney, this is down in Chinatown, where they have the outside the Asian Gallery cinema. So kind of just as a journey, moving out of that, I'll segue into some of our work. The first project that I'll talk about is Parramatta River City, and this is a place where saltwater and freshwater actually meet, and it's the westernmost extent of Sydney Harbour. So we were asked by the council there to come up with an idea for Parramatta, and effectively they wanted to revision their city, kind of looking out to 2050. And so we were very interested in the idea of the brand of Parramatta as the second largest CBD in Sydney, and how we could actually give it more meaning. So we looked at it being a sister to Circular Quay. Everybody knows Circular Quay, and the idea that we developed was, well, let's try and make Parramatta Quay, which in terms of ferry or water transport would be a logical kind of sister to the main centre. And then we zoomed in and we looked at the kind of the consolidated heart of Parramatta and the proposals for a new station to the north, which hasn't emerged, but then the railway station that's already existing, which is a wonderful place, and then the existing wharf and the existing weir on the river, and we decided we wanted to move that upstream. And in doing so, we could take the boats and ferries that at the moment are not actually entering the centre of the CBD, we could move them right up into the centre and then knock down one of the council's car parks, which they own on the waterfront, and then dig out a new harbour, a new quay. And in doing so, also deconstruct the channel, the sort of straight concrete line channel, and then create a network of streets and spaces that engage with the river again, so improving its ecology and then also creating these wonderful kind of urban zones. So what was very important to us, and one of the reasons that Parramatta I think has failed, is that it's like many cities where it's turned its back on its waterfront, it's turned its back on the river. Its greatest asset it's ignored because it's always been a place of flooding, it's been a place to be scared of. So you couldn't occupy those streets because the engineers have said, well, no, that's a flood zone, that has high risk, so we can't occupy it. But of course, these are the places that we want to be. So our idea was very simple. We said, well, let's use the technology that they use in Hamburg with their flood doors and all those engineering. Let's use the engineering as a way of actually safeguarding, and let's get public space and occupation down at river level, so using the flood zone. And then we created an urban form around it that we thought had the right size and density and scale to actually create the space and enough compression so that these streets and waterfront spaces would actually come together and work properly. And then we applied some of the sort of sea level rise, climate change. We applied the flooding over the top of it to check and make sure that these things would still function. So the streets and some of these things were designed to be submerged and then to re-emerge after that event. So it's about adaptation and resilience in the face of the kind of issues that we're facing now with climate change. Green Square Town Centre, this is a project that we've been working on for many, many years, and we won a competition for this in 2001 for the town centre, and then progressively we've been working on the sort of urban fabric. So the entire Green Square renewal area is very large, and there's a whole new network of streets and places that are being applied to effectively brownfields regeneration. A lot of it is industrial, and the reason that the Green Square, it has a railway station there at the moment, but the reason that Green Square was originally settled, it was the largest industrial area in Sydney, and it was because of its access to fresh water. So all those industrial facilities could use that fresh water in their processes, and in doing so they polluted that water, they filled the wetlands, and then they completely changed that landscape. So what we now have is a new town centre that's being built as those industries move away to the outskirts of the city, and the economics change. So the idea that we had was to found a new town centre based on the stream. Very simple idea. And that was to bring the channelized stream that was originally there to the surface. So we built a whole system of what we call the ecological engine, and it drove the sort of the outcomes of a lot of the public space. So the streets that connect across, there was a main plaza that connects to the railway station, a new park, which is Shays Park, and the park was a sort of a biofiltration area, so we were taking stormwater up and using that infrastructure that's flowing under to bring it to the surface, and then to animate the streets and the plazas by creating a new stream that runs right along the surface. So the streets and the plazas that eventuate from that have that density all around. The idea for the new library, which is there's a new competition that's just been held for that, and the idea that we have the transport connector running right through. They're very, very simple materials and simple finishes, using some of these kind of kitted parts that are quite successful in terms of very simple stones, and try not to overburden the design. And then looking at how those streets compress and connect into major open space such as the park. And then the idea was the end of this, there's a building, there's a playground built into it, and then the stream itself is activated by weather events. So this is on the edge of the plaza. When you walk along the street beside, you look down into this, and in dry weather, it has kind of water that's coming out of our ecological engine that's being reused. So it's activating and cascading down these kind of water stairs. But then in the rain, that shuts down, and then the water flows off the plazas and off the streets, and it runs down the same cascade. It's been doing so, it's aerated, and it runs into the stream. The stream actually starts to fill, and it's taking these low flows and cleaning it as it runs down. So the idea that the street and the public space are actually mimicking the real, or the sort of pre-existing ecology and environment, so that we're kind of trying to reveal the engineering and the green infrastructure in a way that people can still relate and understand. This is a street that we've been working on in Maitland, and interestingly enough, Maitland was in the sort of mid-1800s, it was the second largest city in New South Wales, and it was effectively, it's on the Hunter River, and it was used for logging, and they were taking out, they had sheep, wool, and a whole lot of trade that was going on. It was very, very vibrant and very populous. And it's been in the last sort of 15 years, or since the 80s, when they turned the main street, which is called High Street, into a mall. It's been in decline, and it's symptomatic of some of these other projects we've been discussing, where the shopping centre has effectively slowly drained the life out of the main centre. And really, there's very little left here. There's a lot of vacancies. The economy is very, very slow. There's no connection to the river at all. So council actually decided, before they engaged us through community consultation, that they wanted to create a shared zone. So we've been working with them on the idea of the shared zone. And one of the key things for us when we started to look at this was, well, how can we actually re-engage the high street back with the river? And the river is it's quite problematic, because the bank, you can't intervene, because it's a floodway, so you can't actually fix anything on it in case it gets picked up and taken downstream and becomes a missile. So we wanted to try and create a public street against the river and then reconnect it. So that meant that we came up with an idea for a Riverlink building. And we're working with Choi Rapiha on this idea, but it's very much a sense of trying to make a public space that joins the high street to the river, and then in doing so making a waterfront cafe area and a restaurant that will kind of reseed some of the life in Maitland. So at the moment they're not using the river at all. So using the public funds, we're trying to catalyse the sort of destinational qualities of the town. And then the street itself, there was effectively a decluttering exercise. So we're removing all of the paraphernalia in the street. There's a very simple continuing lighting system. And then we're looking at bronze materials, so whether we can cast bronze